The war in Ukraine has left Russia short of military bandwidth. We have seen this in everything from Yevgeny Prigozhin's thunder run on Moscow with the Wagner Group in 2023 to Ukraine's current Kursk offensive inside of Russia. Meanwhile, China has historical claims of land that Russia currently holds, so now would be a good time for China to invade Russia, right? You know, Taiwan's president certainly thinks so, and is not above some gentle trolling on the subject. But will China actually do it? Well, probably not. But the reason is not as obvious as it seems. Rather, a full explanation requires some lines on maps, and Napoleon Bonaparte? Okay, let's do this. The first grumblings of China invading Russia arose about 6 months ago, when reports came out that Russia had played war games between 2008 and 2014 that simulated a Chinese invasion. This was overblown. Powerful countries love preparing contingency plans. It would not surprise you to find out that the United States has war plans already drawn up against everyone. And I do mean everyone. And it is not like Moscow and Beijing have a long history of harmonious relations. The Sino-Soviet split was a long-running rivalry between the two capitals, and the thaw and transition to a no-limits friendship is something new to the Xi Jinping era. Besides, this was Russia simulating a Chinese invasion more than a decade ago, at a time when Russia had no real cause for concern. Not a leak that China itself right now was actually making plans to do so. However, that takes us to the current problem. The latest iteration of this talk came last week, when the well-nicknamed president of Taiwan, William Lai, suggested that Beijing occupy land across the Russia-China border. Now, this was mostly a rhetorical device. Back before the war in Ukraine accelerated to 1,000,000 miles an hour with the Kursk offensive, I had the free time to produce a 90-minute lines-on-maps extravaganza on why the People's Republic of China might want to invade the Republic of China. Beijing's substantive argument is that Taiwan should be a part of a singular China, because historically that has been the case. Meanwhile, Lai's substantive argument essentially aimed to project that same logic elsewhere, and, preferably, away from his capital. You see, back in 1858, China signed a treaty that forked over part of its northeastern territory to Russia. And then in 1860, China signed another treaty that forked over another part of the northeast of the country. This gave rise to the seemingly impossible fact that Russia borders both North Korea and Norway. Remember this part for later. And it also gave Russia the city of Vladivostok, home of the Russian Pacific Fleet. These concessions of land occurred during China's Century of Humiliation, and China still views the terms of the treaties as unjust. So what Lai was saying is that if Taiwan is rightly connected to mainland China, then these areas are as well, and Beijing should spend its free time reacquiring those areas, and pay less attention to what is happening in Taipei, and whatever this random woman is doing. Hey, at least it is not a chicken this time. After all, Russia showed in August that it does not have the ability to defend its borders, no less against a country with a population a third of its size, and who has almost all of its troops preoccupied defending its own territory, and with the foreknowledge that the two are, at war. Certainly Russia would stand no chance against a country 10 times its size, who has 1,000,000 soldiers not doing anything in particular at the moment, and could catch Russia completely off guard, with its forces a full Eurasian continent away. So, Beijing, here is your land. Go and take it. You do not even need to weather the storm of 150 or so kilometers of choppy Taiwan Strait waters to accomplish your mission. You can just drive over. Of course, given the wisdom oozing out of his first name, this was not actually what William Lai was suggesting. Rather, he was arguing that Beijing having irredentist claims regarding its northeast is ridiculous, just as ridiculous as Beijing having irredentist claims regarding Taiwan. Now, whether you believe that to be true will depend on your political perspective. But the idea that China should find it clever to resort to war to annex land currently under Russian control is a question for social scientists to scrutinize. And there is a major logical flaw with the whole idea. Namely, the lines on maps would dictate something else. Trying to get something by force, especially when the antagonist is not an outward enemy, is a silly way to conduct international diplomacy. It is always possible to get a better deal. To see what I mean, let's jump back in time a couple of centuries or so and say hello again to, yes, Napoleon Bonaparte. The year was 1803, a refreshing time when artists still knew how to spell Napoleon, in contrast to our 2024 AI overlords. France was wrapping up about a decade of revolutionary wars, and was about to start another decade of Napoleonic wars. In the shadow of those conflicts, Napoleon was in a bit of a pinch. Stop me if you've heard this one before, but wars are expensive, and the well to draw from is not infinite. And although Napoleon-era France was putting this to the test, seriously, look at this list of France's various opponents over the period. There are only so many things you can do with your military. The bottleneck became apparent in early 1803, when Napoleon started to make plans to invade Great Britain. His chief liability, though, was on the other side of the pond in North America. Just 3 years earlier, Spain had transferred its claim to France to what is now the heartland of the United States. Part of the reason that Imperial Spain did so was that protecting its American possessions was always a challenge. The fledgling United States had the tactical advantage of actually residing right next to the territory, and at any point American settlers might just decide to cross the mighty Mississippi River and declare the territory their own. France inherited that same problem, except that Napoleon was also trying to juggle invading a bunch of other countries at the same time. Sorry, I mean Napoleon. I didn't realize that Pokemon existed in the early 19th century. And so Napoleon began looking for an exit strategy. The solution became known as the Louisiana Purchase, which ceded rights to territories that would later be a part of 15 states. Oh, and there was also this weird part north of Montana that was swapped in 1818 for this territory in North Dakota and Minnesota. All it cost the folks back in Washington was $15 million. Even if you translate that into 2024 dollars, it remains quite the deal. Now, the common retort that you will hear in response to why this was such a bargain price is that the United States was not really buying the territory so much as buying out the French claim to the territory. The land was, by and large, occupied by Native Americans. Heck, the United States did not even really know what was on the land, which is why Thomas Jefferson later set off the Lewis and Clark expedition to figure it out. All of that is true, of course, and contributed to France's flag coming down at the discounted price. But that still does not explain why France parted with it for only $15 million. Remember, if you want to reach a negotiated settlement in international relations, the deals must be commensurate with the balance of military power between the parties. It just so happens that all of those French Revolutionary Wars and the impending Napoleonic Wars were making France incredibly weak on the North American continent. Let's do this with lines. Suppose that the United States launched a campaign to take the Louisiana Territory by force. Then odds are that the expected American share would have been substantial. Imagine that this white line represents the expected outcome. What is north would have become part of America, with the rest having retained French influence. But fighting to obtain such an outcome would be inefficient. Each side would suffer costs of war in the process. Say, the equivalent of the value of territory between the white and navy blue lines for the United States, and the equivalent of what is between the white and red lines for France. So, in a win for lines on maps enthusiasts everywhere, the parties just settled. The $15 million represents what France needed in order to be bought out of the remainder. Indeed, this bit of territory here represents what France would have kept by fighting, net its costs. However, actually keeping that amount of land was impractical. As such, both could further improve the situation with a cash transfer, which is exactly what happened. And so we have the parallel of that today with discussion of China invading parts of Russia. Beijing may very well look at Russian land to the northeast and think that it would make a nice addition to the country. And now may be the best time in decades to try to force the issue, given Moscow's distractions in Ukraine. But the most likely way something like that gets resolved is through a negotiated settlement. Lines. Now, I do not think that we are at this point yet, but one could imagine a fairly unlikely future where Russia becomes increasingly desperate for cash and turns to selling parts of its Far East to raise money. This would simultaneously eliminate any temptation by Beijing to take it by force, while also allowing the Kremlin to ramp up pressure on Ukraine. Call it the Outer Manchuria Purchase. It might not include Vladivostok because Moscow values its aforementioned Pacific Fleet. Let's not forget that part of the reason that Russia invaded Ukraine was about securing Crimea and the Black Sea Fleet base. But there is plenty of other territory in the area. Now, we are already seeing something like this in practice. Let's focus on this area here, because it is where the mix of politics and geography begins to get weird. Back to the zoomed-in map. China is in the northwestern part, North Korea is in the southwestern part, and Russia is in the eastern part. So, again, this is the weird place where North Korea and Russia share a border. Now, the Tumen River forms a border between China and North Korea here, before eventually forming that North Korea-Russia border. Thus, China does not have river access to the North Pacific Ocean, which is something that is not obvious until you get out your binoculars and take a close look at the geography of the region. Wait, did I say that China does not have access? Well, not anymore. In June, Moscow relented by offering Beijing shipping rights through the area. The logic of efficient negotiations remains supreme. If we want to go a step further, for a war to actually start over the issue, you would need some sort of bargaining friction between the two. In other words, we need a reason that the two sides cannot identify a mutually agreeable solution, or cannot commit to one over the long run. That is a possibility. We have discussed before, in the context of gas pipelines, how there seems to be some type of disagreement between the two about how desperate Russia is for money. But an economic dispute is a long way from a militarized one. Meantime, there may also be concerns about whether Russia's weakness is a long-term issue. If it is temporary, China would have an incentive to damage Russia's military capacity in the region beyond repair, thereby preventing Moscow from trying to revisit the terms of a sale, following Russia's recovery from however many years that it spends in Ukraine. That said, these types of preventive wars need the shift in power over time to exceed the territorial equivalent of the combined costs of war for a fight to actually happen. See, this configuration might be trouble. However, though Moscow and Beijing do not have the same ideological consensus as, say, Washington and London, they do benefit a great deal from cooperation. Put differently, sacrificing that cooperation would imply a significant cost, to the extent that war for the reasons described here is hard to imagine. See? Costs get big, and you can agree to something sustainable. Now, Russia is not immune to problems stemming from taxed capacity in Ukraine. It still risks territorial losses with China. We have also seen Russia's inability to uphold peace in Nagorno-Karabakh last year. The Kremlin might face further issues in deterring domestic uprisings in places like Belarus or Kazakhstan. and there may come a time when the Chechen Wars become a part of a trilogy. But in terms of a broad-scale war between China and Russia, it is doubtful. Meanwhile, if you like trilogies, then you are going to be disappointed to learn that I only have 2 books on the war. Sorry. Nevertheless, you can check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care. Seriously, why is it that translators never get chairs with back support?